Victor Goddard's RAF flyover. He flew into a storm and came out into another year. It was 1935. Royal Air Force officer Sir Victor Goddard was flying his Hawker Hart biplane from Andover to Edinburgh. A sudden storm rolled in over the Scottish coast, dark and violent. Wind ripped across the wings. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Goddard tried to stay above the turbulence, but the storm pulled him downward. Through sheets of rain, he recognized the outline of the Drem airfield, a site he knew had been abandoned for years. Except now something didn't fit. The airfield below wasn't derelict. The hangars looked new, the tarmac was clean, and the planes parked below weren't any models he'd ever seen. They were sleek monoplanes, painted in a bright yellow unfamiliar to RAF colors. Mechanics on the ground moved about in blue coveralls, not the brown ones the service used at the time. Then, as quickly as it began, the storm broke apart. Sunlight flashed off the strange yellow wings. Moments later, the airfield vanished back into cloud. Goddard made it to Edinburgh shaken but alive. He couldn't explain what he'd seen, only that it didn't belong to 1935. Back in Andover, Goddard told no one at first. He was a respected officer, later to become air marshal. Stories about visions weren't the kind of thing that built careers, but the image stayed with him. 4 years later, in 1939, he returned to Drem, this time for official inspection. The moment he arrived, he stopped cold. Everything he'd seen during that storm had come true. The airfield had been reopened for the war. Its hangars were restored. Training aircraft had been repainted in that same bright yellow for visibility, and the ground crews were now issued blue overalls, exactly as he'd seen them years earlier. Some said it was coincidence. Others wondered if the storm had somehow bent perception, showing him a fragment of what was to come. When Goddard finally published his account decades later, he insisted he hadn't imagined it. He described it as a vision of a future event, seen not through faith or fantasy, but through a fault line in time itself. His story caught the attention of both physicists and psychologists. Could extreme atmospheric conditions, the charge, the electromagnetic intensity, interfere with how the human brain perceives time? Might the mind, under stress, momentarily slip beyond the present? Some experiments in later decades explored precognitive perception under electrical storm conditions. Participants exposed to sudden electromagnetic changes showed unusual temporal distortions, seconds that felt like minutes, memories of stimuli presented later. The results were inconclusive, but made everyone wonder. If a storm could twist the flow of light, sound, and air, could it also twist the way a person experiences time itself? The Versailles time slip. 2 academics walked through the gardens of Versailles and claimed to have stepped into another century. In August 1901, the summer heat pressed over France as 2 English schoolteachers, Charlotte Anne Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, set out to visit the Petit Trianon, the small secluded estate once belonging to Marie Antoinette. They weren't tourists looking for mystery. Both were academics, logical, observant, and precise. Yet what they described that day would place them among the strangest claims in modern history. The path wound through thick trees, the light dimmed. They later wrote that the air felt heavy, as if sound itself was muffled. The landscape seemed wrong, the angles of the trees, the stillness of the air, even the grass looked pale. Then they noticed the people. Men in tricorn hats, women in full skirts and pastel gowns, a man carrying a wheelbarrow who looked straight out of the 18th century. Confused, they followed the path until they reached a small bridge where a woman sat quietly, sketching. When they finally reached the Petit Trianon, the spell seemed to lift. The noise of modern tourists returned. Everything looked as it should. At first, they said nothing to anyone. Weeks passed before they compared notes. Each had written down what they saw, separately, without consulting the other. And what shocked them was how much their accounts matched. They described the same faces, the same bridge, the same clothing, even the same woman sketching in the same spot. Their story might have faded into a personal anecdote, but in 1911 they published their experiences in a book titled An Adventure. What followed was a storm of attention. Critics accused them of romantic fantasy. Some said they'd stumbled onto a historical reenactment. though no records of such an event exist. Others claimed they had been emotionally overwhelmed, victims of suggestion or heat exhaustion. But then came the small, uncomfortable details. The bridge they described in their notes. It shouldn't have been there. It had been destroyed decades earlier. Yet when researchers checked old architectural plans from the 18th century, they found the exact bridge, matching their description perfectly. And those old-fashioned uniforms, they matched the styles worn by the Queen's personal guards, accurate down to the color of the trim. The case reached the Society for Psychical Research, who studied their testimonies. While many dismissed the claim as imagination, others quietly admitted the consistency of their records was unsettling. The debate split between two camps. One group suggested what's called place memory, the idea that strong emotions or events can leave a kind of imprint in an environment, replaying like a loop for anyone sensitive enough to perceive it. Another group offered a stranger possibility, that Moberly and Jourdain had walked into a micro-temporal overlap, a brief alignment where two moments in time exist in the same physical space. To them, the women hadn't imagined anything. They had simply stepped sideways in time for a few minutes. For the rest of their lives, both women stood by their story. They never sought fame, never revised their accounts for profit, and despite ridicule, they maintained that what they saw felt completely real. Philadelphia Experiment Aftermath. In the middle of World War II, the U.S. Navy faced a critical question: how to make its ships invisible to radar and magnetic detection. The USS Eldridge became the center of a classified series of experiments in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The goal, at least officially, was to test a new form of electromagnetic camouflage. But eyewitnesses from surrounding docks described something that no camouflage could explain. As currents surged through the coils wrapped around the ship's hull, a green mist rose from the deck. Observers claimed the entire vessel flickered, then vanished. Moments later, it was reportedly sighted hundreds of miles away near Norfolk, Virginia, before reappearing in its original berth as if nothing had happened. The aftermath was worse than the event itself. Rumors spread that several sailors were found fused into the metal bulkheads, their bodies half submerged in solid steel. Others wandered the deck in shock, unable to recognize their surroundings, insisting entire days had disappeared. The Navy classified all reports. Years later, declassified memos confirmed limited research into magnetic field manipulation, but no mention of teleportation or invisibility. Still, the eyewitness accounts persisted. By the 1950s, former crewmen began to surface, claiming the project had succeeded, but at the cost of human sanity. They described losing time, hearing strange mechanical echoes in their heads, and watching their hands flicker in and out of sight. Independent researchers dug through ship logs and harbor manifests. None recorded the Eldridge's disappearance, yet letters from civilian port workers referenced a vanishing destroyer. Even the Office of Naval Research later admitted that electromagnetic field tests were real, but stopped short of acknowledging what happened next. Physicists have since speculated that the technology might have generated a localized electromagnetic vortex capable of bending light and distorting magnetic detection. Others suggest the story grew from a misinterpretation of a classified radar countermeasure project. The Dyatlov-Most Bridge anomaly. The soldiers thought they were crossing an ordinary bridge. Minutes later, their radios failed and everything seemed to pause. It was 1957, deep in the hills of what was then Yugoslavia. A small patrol unit moved through the Drina Valley, approaching a narrow bridge called Dyatlov Most. It was a quiet morning, the kind soldiers forget, until something about that crossing changed everything. As they stepped onto the wooden planks, one of them described the air turning thick, almost like walking through water. The light around them dimmed, not from clouds, but from something else, as if color itself had drained away. Their radios cut off mid-sentence. When they finally made it across, one soldier checked his wristwatch. The second hand was frozen. The other's watches had stopped too. To them, the silence lasted about 15 minutes. But when they got back to base, the log officer swore they had been gone more than an hour. They couldn't explain it. None of them could. And soon, neither could anyone else. An immediate medical check found no radiation, no chemical exposure, no head injury. The men's vitals were normal, but every single one of them described the same sensation: dense air, a faint metallic taste, and a strange electric buzzing under the skin. The commanding officer wrote it off as fatigue until locals from a nearby village came forward. They said the soldiers returned much later than expected, even though the patrol route should have taken half that time. To confirm it wasn't imagination, the army sent a team back to Dajalov, most days later. Halfway across, their compasses began to spin erratically. North became meaningless. Every instrument they carried failed for several seconds, then snapped back as if nothing had happened. That report was quietly classified. Years passed before anyone dared test it again. In 1972, researchers from the Belgrade Institute of Physics conducted a geophysical survey of the same area. What they found was stranger than folklore. Magnetometers detected sudden, short-lived spikes, magnetic fluctuations that defied geological explanation. Quartz deposits beneath the surface were unusually concentrated, and some theorized that under pressure they might release electrical fields strong enough to distort magnetic or even temporal readings. It wasn't proof of time distortion, but it wasn't normal either. By the 1980s, Dajalov most had faded from official attention. Then, in 1987, two hikers traveling the same trail reported something. They described the same heavy air, the same stillness, and losing all sense of time while crossing the bridge. When they checked their camera later, the timestamp on one of the photos didn't match the sequence. It read 27 minutes into the future. A month later, the region was sealed off under military safety regulations. No further research was published. The bridge still stands, but access remains restricted. Today, even locals avoid it. Some say it's haunted, others call it cursed. But those who've studied the case think it might be a localized distortion, where natural forces fold for a few moments before snapping back. The Japanese boat anomaly, Japan, 1803. Fishermen haul in a hollow sphere of metal and glass. Inside sits a woman who speaks no known language and carries instruments no one can identify. Off the coast of Hitachi province, a storm had just passed when a strange craft drifted toward shore. At first the fishermen thought it was wreckage, but as it spun in the surf, they saw smooth red metal glinting between wooden ribs. When they pulled it onto the sand, they realized it wasn't like any boat they'd ever seen. It was perfectly round. Glass windows circled the upper half, framed in metal seams that looked forged. The villagers called it the Utsuro Bune, the hollow ship. Officials from nearby towns soon arrived to record the event. They opened the hatch and found a woman sitting calmly inside. Her skin was pale, her hair tinted red, her clothes made from fabric none could name. She spoke softly in a language that didn't match any known dialect. In her hands she clutched a small rectangular box and refused to release it. Even when offered food or shelter, she simply smiled and pointed back toward the sea. The villagers debated what to do. Some feared she was a spirit. Others thought she was a castaway from a distant land, perhaps Russia or Portugal. But her ship told another story. The inner walls were engraved with symbols no one could read. Small circular holes were rimmed in what resembled polished copper, and the windows, transparent and perfectly smooth, were impossible for Edo-era glassmakers to produce. The officials took careful notes, sketching every visible detail. Their drawings later appeared in 3 separate government records between 1803 and 1844, all nearly identical. That kind of consistency was rare. When communication failed and suspicion grew, local custom dictated that unnatural arrivals be returned to the sea. So they carried the vessel back to the water. The woman bowed once, entered her ship, and drifted away until the mist swallowed her completely. She was never seen again. Centuries later, researchers examined the scrolls preserved in Japan's archives. The rivet patterns, curved panels, and precision joints didn't match anything known in Japanese shipbuilding at the time. Some scholars proposed it was a European lifeboat, its origins lost to translation. Others noticed the design looked more like a sealed capsule than a seaworthy craft. And that box, the one she never released, remains the most enduring mystery. None of the records describe what it contained. only that it was metallic, light enough to hold, and treated with deep reverence. Shift. The Siberian plateau stretches endlessly. Few venture there, and fewer return with stories that make sense. In 1987, geologist Timur K. led a state survey team through a remote region east of Yakutsk. Their goal was simple: document mineral seams along an uncharted valley locals called the Still Hollow. Villagers claimed it was a place where time held the sun, where day never seemed to end. Most brushed it off as folklore. Timur didn't. That morning, with 2 assistants and a pack mule, he descended into the basin, instruments running, compasses calibrated, radio link open. At first, everything seemed normal. Then the readings began to drift. Halfway down the slope, the compass needles started to spin. The air thickened, though no storm clouds gathered. The light, bright and colorless, refused to shift, no matter how long they stayed. Back at camp, the rest of his crew tried raising him on the radio. There was no reply. The signal meter jumped erratically, then flatlined. They waited for hours. When contact finally returned, it was faint, then gone again. 12 hours passed before Timur reappeared at the ridge, looking dazed but unharmed. To him it had been no more than 30 minutes. The logs confirmed a different thing. At base, the radio blackout lasted almost half a day, but on the recording, the silence covered only half an hour. It was as if time had stretched in one place and contracted in another. When Timur checked his wristwatch, the hands still pointed to 14:07, the time he'd entered the valley. They hadn't moved, but his camera's timestamp told a different story. The photos he took in of rock faces, survey poles, and an odd bluish fog were marked with the date of the following day. Even stranger, the air temperature logged by his instruments was 10 degrees warmer than any nearby station reported. Barometric readings didn't match regional conditions at all. When he submitted his findings to the Regional Science Board in Yakutsk, they dismissed them as instrumental error due to environmental interference. His notes were filed and forgotten. Years later, fragments of his field journal surfaced in private collections. In them, Timur wrote a single line that still puzzles researchers today. The valley has no time of its own, it only borrows from ours. National Airlines Flight 102 time loss. On a clear night in April 1997, National Airlines Flight 102 lifted off from Miami International Airport bound for Houston. A standard route. Clear weather. No turbulence in the forecast. Midway through the flight, radar contact was lost. Controllers assumed a transponder fault, until minutes became hours. 3 hours later, the Boeing 727 reappeared on approach to Houston, perfectly stable, fully fueled, and on autopilot. When the crew re-established contact, they reported nothing unusual. To them, only 20 minutes had passed, but every air traffic record disagreed. The flight had been missing from radar for 2 hours and 43 minutes. Once the aircraft landed, the confusion deepened. Ground crews expected low fuel. Instead, tanks were nearly full. No mechanical anomalies showed on inspection. The flight recorder told a stranger story. Engine output was consistent the entire trip, as if the plane had flown uninterrupted. But every onboard clock, flight deck, cabin, even passenger wristwatches, lagged exactly 2 hours and 43 minutes behind UTC time. When it cleared, they assumed the disturbance had lasted seconds. Instead, it had spanned nearly 3 hours. Investigators scoured regional radar logs across Florida and the Gulf. Nothing that could explain a complete loss of contact without physical deviation. The official report listed the cause as instrument error and possible temporal miscalibration, a phrase that appeared nowhere else in FAA documentation. Behind closed doors, the airline quietly compensated passengers and issued a non-disclosure agreement to its crew. Unofficial memos referenced anomalous radio propagation, but no public statement was ever made. Independent analysts later noted that several military radar stations along the Gulf recorded a brief signal void, a total blackout across multiple frequencies. At the exact moment Flight 102 disappeared. No military exercises were scheduled in that airspace. Whistleblower accounts years later suggested the FAA reclassified the case under restricted review, citing national security concerns. The Bold Street, Liverpool time slip. It began on a normal Saturday afternoon near Waterstone's bookshop, one of Liverpool's busiest corners. A brief flicker appeared in the air, like a shimmer of heat. Then, for several seconds, people claimed the street changed. Gas-style lamps stood where modern lights had been. Horse-drawn carts rolled past storefronts that hadn't existed for half a century. And among the crowd, men and women in Edwardian dress walked calmly as if they belonged there. When the moment passed, everything returned to normal. No trace of the distortion remained. Local police reportedly received a tape from a nearby security camera showing a visual ripple and several figures that didn't match the 1990s crowd. Witnesses described feeling dizzy, pulled, or lightheaded, as if gravity itself had shifted for an instant. The event was catalogued but quickly classified as inconclusive. The tape, if it existed, was never shown publicly. Rumours spread fast through Liverpool. One witness, an off-duty constable named Frank, later told reporters he'd seen the street turn old. He described the shop fronts as faded, with signage written in fonts he couldn't recognize. And a woman standing beside him suddenly vanished, replaced by another passerby entirely. Online forums in the late 90s debated the event as early digital communities took hold. Some called it a hoax, the result of a doctored VHS tape and local storytelling flair. Others linked it to electromagnetic interference from the city's old tram network buried below Bold Street, once powered by high-voltage cables and iron rails. Still, multiple people who'd been there described the same sensations: the smell of old smoke, a brief drop in temperature. When researchers later analyzed alleged still frames from the supposed CCTV footage, they found anachronisms, not from the Edwardian era, but from post-war Liverpool of the early 1950s. Shop names, fashion details, even bus advertisements matched photos from that period. So had the witnesses seen a glimpse of the past, or fragments of older films superimposed on the present through a technical fault. No one could say for sure. The police tape disappeared into storage and was never located again. Only third-hand copies and written testimonies remain, each slightly different, but all anchored to that same patch of Bold Street pavement. Years later, a physics team at the University of Liverpool studied the area's magnetic profile. They found unusually high levels of ferrous interference beneath the road, relics of the old tram lines that ran directly under the site. It could explain a camera malfunction, they said, but not a shared human perception of another time. Negev Desert Time Dilation. It was 1972, and an Israeli Defense Forces recon team set out on a simple mapping assignment. No combat, no pressure, just charting a narrow canyon deep in the Negev. The kind of mission soldiers described as mind-numbingly quiet. But the desert had its own agenda that day. The heat shimmered across the dunes, bending light and sound. Radio chatter faded, then warped into faint echoes of their own voices. At first, they thought it was a bad signal. Then, their instruments began to fail one by one. Halfway through the gorge, the static thickened until every transmission went dead. The men called out to each other thin into the hot air. One soldier's compass needle spun continuously. Another swore he saw the canyon walls pulse as if breathing. A few minutes later, the nausea hit. The sunlight flickered between yellow and white. When they finally stumbled out of the canyon, the sun hung exactly where it had been when they entered. Their watches showed 32 minutes of elapsed time. But when they radioed the base, the operator told them they'd been missing for 2 hours. The confusion turned to alarm. Their commander confirmed the logs. Contact lost at 11:18, regained at 13:22. Yet all 6 soldiers insisted it hadn't been more than half an hour. Medical tests later showed mild dehydration, consistent with 2 hours of desert exposure, not 30 minutes. And their heart rate monitors, still recording from the mission, displayed an impossible jump. 2 hours of physiological activity compressed into a 30-minute window. The official report labeled it environmental interference. The team was briefed to remain silent, their debrief classified. Weeks later, the canyon's coordinates were removed from future training maps. A follow-up geological survey detected abnormally high magnetic flux along the rock strata. readings that didn't match any known regional pattern. One of the researchers, speaking off record years later, said quietly, "It wasn't a mirage. It was a pocket. Something was wrong with the air inside it." Rudolph Fentz disappearance. In mid-century New York, police reportedly found a man dressed for another age, a top hat, a watch chain, coins minted in 1876. He appeared on a modern street and vanished from the historical record alike. The story begins one summer night around 1950 in the middle of Times Square. A man suddenly appeared in the middle of the street, confused and disoriented. Moments later, he was struck by an oncoming taxi. When officers arrived, they found something that didn't fit the time or place. His clothes were decades out of date, a high-collared coat, stiff hat, and polished shoes from another century. His pockets held a few coins, all minted in 1876, a copper token from a saloon, long since closed, and a letter addressed to a Mr. Rudolph Fentz, written in looping Victorian handwriting. At first, police assumed it was a prank or a costume, but the man's expression, frozen in confusion, told a different story. Whoever he was, he hadn't expected to be in 1950. Investigators began digging into the name. Rudolph Fentz. It wasn't in any modern record, but old directories from the late 1800s mentioned a man by that name, a clerk, who disappeared without trace in 1876. Newspapers from that year described a missing person who'd left home for an evening walk and never returned. Family members had reported him gone. The description matched the man found on the street nearly 75 years later, right down to the age, clothing, and personal effects. But when archivists tried to confirm the case, they found nothing. Radio shows retold it. Paranormal magazines cited it as proof that time travel might not need machines at all, that sometimes people simply fell out of one century and into another. Was it a true event lost to poor record-keeping, or a perfectly engineered urban myth designed to feel real because it could be?